Okay, so I wouldn't normally be talking about mermaids. I never thought a few years ago that I'd ever find myself in a room talking about mermaids, and yet now that seems to be all I ever bloody do. Because we have mermaids at the Horniman Museum, and so it gave me an opportunity to do some research on them. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with what a Feejee mermaid is, a Feejee mermaid is one of these. It's a physical specimen, tangible, pick-upable object of a mermaid. And they were made quite famous by this guy here, P.T. Barnum, who exhibited one around the States and around Europe from about 1840 right the way through until probably at the point it was destroyed in the 1860s, possibly the 1880s. No one's quite sure because he had a couple of museums, two of which burnt down, and it was probably in one of those. So this is the actual eponymous Feejee mermaid. And I want you to have a look at it now, and I'll show you more pictures of it later on, but it has become effectively a type specimen of constructed, manufactured mermaid. Now, mermaids don't all look like that. Mermaids have been depicted in history through different cultures in lots of different ways. They have a very, very good vintage. They've been going back a minimum of 7,000 years, and Darren earlier showed some depictions from cave paintings which go back far further. So, mermaids are deeply ingrained in the human kind of consciousness. But of course, we call them mermaids, but really what is a mermaid? They're often depicted as male forms, so this is a Triton from Greek depictions. The earliest female representation that I've been able to track down is probably Atagatis, who was a goddess who was human in form, then killed her human lover by accident and ended up tried to drown herself, and instead she turned into a fish. The usual sort of story you'd expect to get from gods and goddesses. And Atagatis is quite a nice one. And after that, you start seeing many more female forms of mermaids. So this is Messuline, who's a mermaid with two fish legs, well, fish tails, like legs. And she only became fishy when she was immersed in water, which is a little bit like the film Splash, which is where I got the idea from. And you might recognise that from a very popular brand of evil coffee. And they're quite well depicted in bestiaries and so on, and they're very well established. There are also more recent depictions. This is Mami Wata, which is a West African water spirit, who is very heavily influenced by Europeans going to Africa for the slave trade. And so this is probably from, well, this particular depiction is probably from the 1960s, but the earlier forms of Mami Wata go back to probably the beginning of the end of the 19th century. They're not that recent. Oh, sorry, they're not that old. Interestingly, Mami Wata is a name that's also used for manatees that you get along the coast of West Africa. There's a very clear link between the water spirit and manatees, even though they're depicted in a totally different way. And this has been kind of a long, ongoing thing, this whole link between the Sirenia and mermaids. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Of course, more modern depictions, and certainly European depictions, tend to have a beautiful woman with a fishy tail. So it's the one that we see most frequently in the culture that we're immersed in. And so that's what we tend to think of as being a mermaid. But of course, some people just take liberties with the whole mermaid idea, especially recently. Darren talked about this earlier, mermaids of 40 found. I'm not even going to get started because it makes me so angry talking about that awful couple of documentaries, absolutely atrocious, really bad communication of science. The thing which annoys me most has nothing to do with the actual mermaids in it, because that was bad, and the whole aquatic ape hypothesis being included in that was kind of crap. But the thing that really annoyed me about it was that they suggested that whales were being beached with bleeding from the ears. Has anyone seen a whale's ear embedded deep under loads of blubber? There's no external auditory meatus. How are they bleeding from it? Little things like that, which just... Anyway, I promised I wouldn't do this, so I'm moving on. So the mermaids I'm going to be talking about are the ones from the Japanese culture. And that's something which is quite separate to the mermaids that we think about. And there are overlaps. Some Japanese depictions of mermaids have been very similar to the European depictions, with a beautiful woman with a fishy tail. But some of them are more like this, where you have a very human face on a very fishy body, And it's not the whole torso, it's just the head. And actually, I've noticed a very distinct similarity between these and big-head wrasse, which have these, I should have included a picture, which have kind of a chin and a big lumpy forehead, and they actually do look quite human in their facial features, as much as a big fish can. There are other forms. Now, this is the kind which I'm really talking about when I refer to the Feejee mermaid, and this is the kind which is depicted quite a lot in Japanese culture, especially in the 19th century and late 18th century. These are very, very particular forms, and you'll notice that they all have a similarity in terms of how they are posed. But I'll come to that in a minute. What we don't have is a single idea about what a type specimen of a mermaid would look like. If you can't define what something actually is, if you can't define what a mermaid is, how can you say when you've found one? And this is something which is a fundamental to science. This is why we have type specimens in science, because you have something which you use to say this, I can hold it up, you can come and have a look at it, you can come and dissect it, you can come and look at it with a microscope if you want. This is a physical, tangible representation of what I am talking about. If you don't have that, you don't have any frame of reference for actually understanding what everyone's talking about. So a mermaid in popular European culture is a beautiful woman and doesn't look like a manatee or a dugong. And so when you see discussions about mermaids cited by Christopher Columbus, for example, or various other people who have reported mermaids in sea voyages, they tend to comment how ugly they are. They're nothing like you'd expect. And that's probably because they are talking about things like manatees and dugongs. They also mention how they taste, because obviously if you're at sea and you see something that looks like a mermaid, you just kill it and eat it. Why would you? And this is quite a common thing. So apparently they taste like veal. Who would have thunk it? But without actually having something tangible to say this is what a mermaid is, everything that you describe that relates back to mermaids as a concept will always be wrong. They will never be an actual mermaid, because unless you actually say this is a mermaid, it will be whatever else you call it. So for example, the Sirenia, i.e. the manatees, the dugongs, the sea cows, they are the Sirenia, they're not mermaids. As soon as you have a type specimen for them, they're totally defined. That means you cannot have any flexibility in how you interpret it. And this is one of the things with cryptozoology. As soon as something's described, as soon as, say, for example, the okapi is described and you have a specimen which you can tangibly go and interact with, it means that stories that relate to that thing can either be related directly to it, or they have to go somewhere else. And this is one of those interesting areas where getting the kind of the pulling cryptids in and saying, well, actually, is this a reference to a real physical animal, or is this a construct, a cultural story, which is feeding into this and other animals as well? It becomes really, really murky, and that's one of the problems with cryptozoology, is defining the kind of what's real, what's just about stories. And stories are interesting in their own right. There's nothing wrong with stories. I'd say there's a lot of anthropology which hinges on interesting stories about snakes or mermaids or whatever. They're fascinating in their own right, and that's something we should be exploring from a different perspective from the scientific stuff which we look at in terms of looking at animals. So type specimens, going back to type specimens, if we had a type specimen of a mermaid, would it look like this? Would it be very fishy based, or would it be like this? Would it be very mammal based? What would the anatomy be? Without a physical specimen, you can't tell. And so back in 1822, a ship's captain called Samuel Barrett Eads was very excited indeed, when he came across this specimen in Jakarta, which he bought off a couple of Dutch, hucksters as it turns out, who'd been trading through Japan and through Nagasaki. He bought this specimen for a ludicrous sum of money at the time, about $6,000. And in order to do that, he had to sell the ship that he was the captain of to generate the capital to buy this. This is in 1822. That is a fortune in 1822. That's something like 3 years of Darwin's personal stipend from his father. And he was a rich man. It's a lot of money. Of course, if you've got the type specimen of a mermaid, and that's this particular image, this engraving, is taken from a pamphlet which was produced by Eads, and he kind of started circulating it, describing it as a species of mermaid, a physical, proper specimen, a real specimen that he wanted to get scientifically assessed to actually have a proper species description published. So he would be holding the type specimen, which would obviously attract a huge amount of interest, get lots of people to come and see it, and therefore he'd be able to make his money back. Totally worthwhile. Who needs a ship when you've got a mermaid? So when he arrived in Britain, he took it to the Royal College of Surgeons, and at the time, the most eminent scientists who dealt with anatomy were William Clift, Sir Edward Home was the most he was the most famous chap at the time, but actually William Clift, his assistant and curator at the conservator at the Royal College of Surgeons, he was a really, really good anatomist. And so it went to him, and he described this specimen. He went and saw it while it was sitting, of course, in customs, because when it arrived in Britain, customs didn't know what to make of this thing. Is it a fish? Is it a mammal? What is it? So they just locked it away for a couple of months while they tried to work out what duties they should charge for it. And while it was sitting there in storage, it was described. And the description was done in a notebook because it wasn't actually worth them spending extra time on writing a full description for publication, because they concluded that it was the head and torso of a monkey sewn to the body of a fish, probably a salmon. In fact, it's a very weird description, because they were talking about the jaws being part orangutan and possibly some other simian torso. So they didn't really know what monkey it was or what primate it was, but it must be a primate of some sort. That immediately makes me wonder about how accurate this description is, because it's sounding a bit far-fetched. And one of the interesting things to consider is that in Britain at the time, taxidermy was really well established. People were kind of beginning to buy into this whole taxidermy thing as something really, really worthwhile, and it was very, very common. People were doing it. It wasn't necessarily done in the best possible way. The real kind of good quality taxidermy didn't start appearing in Britain until the 1850s, but it was actually quite common for people to taxidermy things then. And so it was obvious to the guys in the Royal College of Surgeons that if you're going to make a mermaid, you do it by stitching a couple of things together. But of course, in Japan, where this actually came from, taxidermy at the time was not even known. People didn't practice taxidermy, which is interesting. And when we talk about these things being manufactured, and it was a manufactured object, quite clearly, because there were seams and there were things in there which didn't look right for a real animal. We start asking questions about authenticity and whether or not, by something being manufactured, it makes it a fake or a hoax. And those are the first things that come to our mind. It's a fake, it's a hoax. But actually, there were people making fake mermaids. These are dugongs, which have been dried in the sun with a cord tied around their neck to give them a more rounded head. And so they were being sold, and this is in 1905. They're being sold to Europeans from the East Indies. People were buying them because they were curios. They were depicting these mystical mermaids, and people really were being taken in by these hoax specimens. But was this Feejee mermaid, was this specimen which was being described by Home and Clift, was that actually a fake? And I don't think it was. I think what it is it was very similar to this specimen, which was collected around the same time, between 1817 and 1824. And this is a specimen held in Leiden at the moment. It's still there. And it was collected by Jan Koch-Blomhoff, who was the director of the trading island, which was the only point of trade with Japan for the rest of the world. It was only the Dutch and I think the Chinese who were able to trade with Japan. And there's only one point in Japan they could trade from, and that was from the Dejima in Nagasaki, which is in the bay, an artificial island built purely for trade. And only the Dutch were allowed to trade from there. And this specimen was purchased at a Mizumono Carnival, which is like this big Japanese kind of carnivals where they had all sorts of arts and crafts and all sorts of interesting things going on. and there are pretty good reports of when this was acquired. And this is all during this period of Sakuku, which is when Japan was a closed country. And so really there was no good connections between Japan and the rest of the world. And that's what makes this so interesting, the fact that you're talking about a culture which is largely isolated from influences from the West. So it's a real difference between Britain and Japan. But what you find in Japan is, at the time, it's been referred to as the land of the kami, which are kind of spirits, Shinto and Buddhist spirits. And you find lots of depictions of spirits like the Ningyo, which is, or Ningyo, which is the mermaid, and the kappa. Some of you might have heard of the kappa, which are these funny little water sprites that I think drown babies and are obsessed with anuses for some reason. Who knows? And these were very, very commonly depicted. They were commonly described. And actually, you find Shinto shrines and Buddhist shrines today still with depictions, physical models of different sorts of these spirits, these water spirits or these spirits of the air. And it's no different with the Ningyo, these mermaids. These are from temples, and these are quite old specimens. And this one's reported to be over 1,000 years old. I don't believe it, but it's reported to be over 1,000 years old. Now, these all conform, like the Feejee mermaid that Barnum showed, which was the same specimen that Eads, Samuel Barrett Eads, the guy who sold his ship, they were the same specimen. That was one specimen. It's just that it went from Eads, and basically it went to Eads' son after Eads died, and he sold it to the guys who then passed it on to Barnum. So it has quite an interesting history in its own right. But that specimen and the Jan Koch-Blomhoff one I showed you a minute ago, and these, they all have the same pose with their hands up to their face in a kind of the scream pose, as I like to call it. And that scream type all seem to come from the very early part of the 19th century. And this is the Feejee mermaid being depicted in various ways. Barnum was incredible for hype. He was able to use the media for doing all sorts of things. The press loved him because he was able to get interesting stuff out to them all the time. And they also hated him because he played them like a fiddle. It was amazing. He would sometimes get 2 articles in the same newspaper written from 2 different perspectives that he put in, saying, this thing's a fake, it's a load of rubbish, and someone else, himself, saying under a different pen name, no, it's not, it's totally legitimate, look at this and look at this. That was the kind of way he played it. But the specimen has that very, very similar hands to the face pose. And that's a pose which you get before the black ships of 1854, which are basically what forced Japan open to trade with the rest of the world. And from that point onwards, you start seeing the crawling type, as I like to call it, of mermaid, which was first described by Francis Buckland in 1858. And what I think is happening is that Japan was having these very traditional depictions of mermaids, or Ningyo, I think is the pronunciation, in shrines and temples and so on. And then they switched to this, what I would refer to as tourist type specimen, after Japan opened up for trade with the rest of the world. And the reason why is because the demand for mermaids in museums in Britain and in America suddenly went through the roof because the P.T. Barnum mermaids, when he was displaying that, it was generating a vast amount of interest and therefore a vast amount of money. Everyone had to have a mermaid to compete with Barnum. And the demand was going to Japan. So this is the new kind of mermaid that was being produced, I say new, from the middle of the 19th century. And we have one at the Horniman Museum, which is this. He's lovely, a beautiful little chap, charismatic, lovely. So we decided to have a look at him and see how that construction matched up with what had been described in the past as a monkey sewn to fish. And that's how it was described. It came to us with the name Japanese monkey fish, because it's completely embedded in the consciousness of museum professionals that these things are monkey sewn to fish. Of course, one quick look shows that it's definitely not a monkey sewn to a fish, because if you look at the teeth, they're very clearly not monkey teeth, they're fish teeth. They don't have a set of 4 incisors in the top and bottom jaws. They have several rows in there. Out of interest, how many of you are just counting your incisors? Because all primates have that. A couple of lemurs are a bit weird, but it doesn't have that. It's clearly a fish, actually. We've taken DNA samples which didn't work when we tried to sequence them because they were too degraded. And we've taken some X-rays to try to get a better understanding of how the thing was put together. And we got some information from that. It's quite cool. We were impressed by the kind of brain matter that appeared to be in there. So to get a better understanding of all of that, we decided to CT scan it. So this is a CT scan through the skull, or the head rather, of a mermaid. You can see the fish jaws, which are high density bone. And then you can see papier-mâché, then plaster, then a load of string, which is what looks like a brain, then a wooden stick with a hole in it, and it's been wrapped around, and that's pretty much it. So it's actually a very, very simply constructed item made out of bits of old wood, string, plaster, and so on. We dissected the rest of the body using going through the CT image, and it was a nightmare doing this. And James Moffat from St George's University did a really good job of this because, frankly, it was hideous because the difference in densities between the different layers of the actual specimen's construction weren't very great. The densities were very similar, which makes it really hard to see the differences in a CT scan. And so the easiest things to spot were the kind of twisted steel wire that goes up the centre as an armature, and these pieces of wood which are basically just wedged together and pegged together with bamboo pins. And this is a different density of wood to this, so we know that they come from different sources. And then all of these various bits have been used to kind of bulk out the body bit. So you've got string wrapped around the top there for the head. The arms, one of them's made of wood and then wire. The other one is made of what looks like rolled up paper and wire. So this hasn't been made in a really professional way. They haven't planned it out. They just grabbed whatever's to hand and just cobbled it together. There's a nice little ring here. We weren't sure what that was for a while, then realised that someone's repaired it with araldite at some point in the past. Not while it's been in the Horniman Museum, I hasten to add. Because of the high density of this ring, it showed up actually in the X-rays as well. It's very clearly a very, very high density adhesive. Then someone's put clay over the specimen to give it a nice form, and then the jaws have been kind of shoved into the clay, and these are the kind of bony bits of the fish tail which gets added on last. So you've got a fish tail there, real fish tail, carp, judging by the scale structure, and then papier-mâché over the rest of it to make it look like a real thing, and then that's beautifully sculpted. And these things were being produced in large quantities. So these are by far the most common sorts of mermaids that you still find. They were certainly coming from Japan in the early stages, but later on they started being manufactured in America quite a lot more. So there are a couple of notable gaff manufacturers in the States. So this is an American version, which is frankly bloody awful. And I think that's being shown under the actual name of, this is the Feejee mermaid that Barnum showed. It's clearly not. It looks nothing like it. What this does show us is that there's an awful lot of mermaids out there. They've all been manufactured using different kind of techniques, usually just cobbling stuff together. And what I wanted to kind of try to work out is if any of them actually had any monkey, for example, for that original description. Now these crawling types, we've got a pretty good idea from looking at the similarity of their construction with the one that we've done some proper analysis on. These are all made in basically the same way. We can work that out. I mean, certainly just looking at the teeth tells you that they've all used fish jaws. Looking at the way in which they've been sculpted, this one's probably been made by the same person, if not in the same kind of family unit or in the same workshop, if that's the way they were constructing these things. Again, this one. There are many of them which are almost... You can not tell them apart in some instances. There's certainly one from Italy which is almost identical to one in the Booth Museum. There are so many similarities, they're very clearly made in the same way. But the one thing we don't know about is this Ningyo type, the ones which are displayed in shrines, with the hands to the face. And this is the type that the Feejee mermaid corresponds most closely to. Now, that's one from the British Museum, and they have taken X-rays of it. And those X-rays, again, show you've got fish teeth, you've not got any real skeletal structure in there. What you've got is some nicely sculpted ribs, various bits of metal and junk. There is a fish vertebra. You can see fish vertebrae running along the length there, so they've shoved a fish tail on there without taking the insides out, which is nice. And this is one of the older specimens as well. So what we can tell is that actually these monkeys attached to fish, well, there's definitely fish in there, but there is no monkey. There's no reason to say these are monkeys sewn to fish. So what I'm proposing is that we try to break down the different sorts of mermaids that you find in museum collections. And I say there are two main types. You have the ones which have been based around the Shinto shrine type, the scream type mermaid, which is, I'm calling Pseudo-Siren Eads' eye, because Eads was the first person to try to accurately document the specimen and propose one as a type. The other one I'm suggesting should be Pseudo-Siren Buckland eye, the crawling type, because the first depiction of that is from 1858, which is a written description by Buckland. Now, I'm not saying these are real types, obviously, but what that does is it allows us to start thinking about these objects as being more than just fakes. It allows us to think about them as having a social history which we can tap into to get a better understanding of why they were produced in the first place and what they can tell us about subsequent use and distribution around the world. And that links into a lot of interesting history about trade between Japan and the rest of Europe. Now, there are a lot of people who have been involved in the research, so I'm just going to list their names there and not really mention anyone else.